There are languages that shape nations, and then there are languages that defy them. Picture this: a tongue so dangerous to those in power that speaking it could cost you everything, yet somehow, against all odds, it survived. Not in grand speeches or official decrees, but in the silent spaces between stones, in the shadows of archways, and in the quiet gestures of those who refused to let it die. This is the story of a forbidden language that outlasted empires, not through force, but through the ingenious use of architecture and the unbreakable will of its people. Think about the last time you walked through an old building, running your fingers along its walls. What if those very stones held secrets? For centuries, marginalized communities facing persecution found a way to preserve their language by embedding it into the structures around them, carving symbols into doorframes, hiding words in decorative patterns, even encoding messages into the layout of sacred spaces. These weren't just acts of survival, they were acts of rebellion. Every curve of a pillar, every arrangement of tiles became a silent shout against erasure. And the most remarkable part, those in power never even noticed. So why does this matter today? Because language isn't just a tool for communication, it's the heartbeat of a culture, the thread that connects generations. When a language is banned, it's not just words that are lost, it's identity, memory, and resistance. The story we're about to unravel isn't just a footnote in history, it's a testament to human ingenuity and the unyielding desire to be remembered. By the time we're done, you'll never look at an old building or a whispered conversation the same way again. This is how a forbidden language lived on, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the world to listen. The forbidden language we're exploring wasn't just any dialect, it was a living rebellion. Some scholars argue it began as a sacred tongue, whispered in temple rituals or passed down through generations as a spiritual inheritance. Others believe it emerged as a coded dialect among rebels, a way to organize resistance under the noses of oppressive rulers. What's undeniable is this: those in power saw it as dangerous enough to ban. Imagine a language so potent that merely speaking it could unravel an empire's control. Authorities didn't just fear the words themselves, they feared what those words represented: unity, identity, and a refusal to disappear. Take the example of medieval Spain, where certain communities faced brutal suppression. Their language wasn't just forbidden, it was erased from official records, scrubbed from public life. Yet in hidden courtyards and behind closed doors it thrived. Parents taught their children rhymes that doubled as secret histories. Craftsmen wove symbols into textiles, embedding stories into everyday objects. Even the way homes were built, specific patterns in brickwork, the alignment of doorways held meaning only the initiated could decipher. This wasn't just preservation, it was defiance disguised as decoration. Why would a language provoke such fear? Because words carry more than meaning, they carry power. A shared tongue can bind people tighter than laws, and rulers knew that. When a community speaks in a code outsiders can't crack, it becomes untouchable. The forbidden language wasn't just a tool for communication, it was a shield, a weapon, and a lifeline. And so, in the quiet spaces between official edicts, it grew roots deeper than any law could rip out. What survives today isn't just a linguistic curiosity, it's proof that some voices can't be silenced, no matter how hard the world tries. Silence can be louder than words when words are forbidden. In places where speaking the wrong language could mean imprisonment, or worse, communities mastered the art of secrecy, turning everyday moments into acts of preservation. Lullabies hummed to children carried more than melodies. They held the rhythms of a forbidden tongue, teaching pronunciation and grammar under the guise of soothing songs. Proverbs passed down as simple wisdom often concealed double meanings, embedding historical truths or coded instructions within seemingly harmless phrases. Even folk tales told around fires or in hushed gatherings became Trojan horses for language lessons, disguising verb conjugations and vocabulary as the twists and turns of a story. This wasn't unique to one culture or time. Think of the Navajo code talkers in World War II, whose language, once suppressed, became an unbreakable cipher on the battlefield. Or consider leet speak, the digital slang of early internet forums, where letters were replaced with numbers and symbols to evade censorship or surveillance. What connects these examples across centuries and continents is the same brilliant strategy. When you can't speak freely, you innovate. Silence wasn't surrender. It was a way to outmaneuver oppression, to keep a language alive in the spaces where power wasn't looking. The most powerful part, these methods relied on trust. Elders whispered to the young in back rooms or during walks in the woods, choosing moments when no outsiders could listen. Knowledge wasn't written down, it was woven into the fabric of daily life, shared only with those who'd protect it. This created an unbroken chain, a hidden river of language flowing beneath the surface of sanctioned speech. And while rulers burned books and banned public use of the tongue, they couldn't stop a mother singing to her child or a grandfather spinning a tale. The language survived because it became more than words. It became memory, identity, and love. Now, imagine standing in a centuries-old courtyard, your hand brushing against a wall carved with intricate patterns. What if those swirls and lines weren't just decoration? What if they were a map, a poem, or even a grammar lesson, etched in stone for those who knew how to read them? The next chapter of this story isn't spoken, it's built. Walk into any ancient building and you're not just stepping into a structure, you're stepping into a coded message. Take Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, where hundreds of stone cubes hang from the ceiling like a frozen choir. At first glance, they're just intricate carvings, but scholars believe they're part of a musical cipher, each cube representing a specific note. When mapped out, they might form a lost medieval melody, a song preserved in stone because it was too dangerous to sing aloud. Or consider the Alhambra in Spain, where the walls shimmer with calligraphy so ornate it looks like mere decoration. Yet woven into those swirling Arabic scripts are poems, proverbs, and even political statements, hidden in plain sight under the noses of rulers who would have destroyed them if they'd understood. This wasn't just artistry, it was strategy. Builders and craftsmen became cryptographers, turning pillars into textbooks and tiles into treasure maps. In some homes, the very layout of rooms followed sacred geometry that mirrored the syntax of the forbidden language, so walking through the space was like walking through a sentence. Door frames might be carved with symbols that spelled out blessings or warnings, visible only to those who knew how to read them. Even the direction a staircase spiraled could hold meaning, a silent nod to cultural beliefs outlawed by those in power. The risk was immense. In an era when a single misplaced word could mean death, embedding a language into architecture required meticulous planning and unwavering trust. Stonemasons likely worked in small, secretive groups, passing down techniques through whispers. A misplaced chisel stroke could expose them, so every mark had to serve dual purposes, beautiful enough to avoid suspicion, meaningful enough to carry the language forward. And it worked. While empires rose and fell, these structures stood firm, safeguarding words their builders never lived to speak aloud. What's astonishing is how ordinary these hiding places seemed. A merchant's house in Cairo might have floor tiles arranged in a pattern that taught verb conjugations. A synagogue in Prague could feature ceiling beams carved with astrological symbols that doubled as a calendar in the banned tongue. The genius lay in the duality. To outsiders, it was decoration. To initiates, it was an entire education. This wasn't just about preserving language. It was about ensuring that even if every book was burned and every teacher silenced, the stones themselves would keep teaching. Today, we might miss the message entirely, walking past these clues without a second glance. But for those who know what to look for, these buildings are more than historical relics. They're living archives. Every curve, every pattern, every seemingly random detail is a testament to human resilience. The next time you visit an old church or castle, look closer. The walls might be whispering. When words were too dangerous to speak aloud, symbols became the silent revolutionaries of language. Picture a weaver at her loom, tying knots into a rug not just for beauty, but to spell out proverbs in a tactile code. Or a stonemason carefully arranging floor tiles in what seemed like random patterns until you realized they formed the opening lines of a banned prayer. This was visual cryptography at its most ingenious, where every brushstroke or carved vine could carry the weight of entire sentences. Religious art became especially potent for this hidden communication. In medieval Europe, where certain beliefs could get you branded a heretic, artists smuggled forbidden ideas into church frescoes. A saint's halo might subtly incorporate runes from a persecuted language. The folds of a marble statue's robe could conceal tiny, precise markings like the veins in a leaf hiding an entire alphabet. Even heraldry, those elaborate family crests, often doubled as linguistic puzzles. What looked like a nobleman's proud lion might actually be a rebuse, its pose and accessories spelling out a phrase in the forbidden tongue when read correctly. Gardens, too, became open-air libraries. The labyrinths of medieval monasteries weren't just for meditation. Their winding paths traced the grammatical structure of sacred texts when walked in a specific sequence. Flower beds planted in particular shapes could represent verb conjugations, with roses for past tense and lavender for future. This wasn't mere symbolism. It was a full grammatical system disguised as landscaping. Behind every hidden symbol stood ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of preservation. The rug weaver teaching her daughter that 3 knots in a row meant remember, while 4 meant resist. The glassblower who added nearly imperceptible bubbles to church windows to mark vowel sounds. These weren't trained cryptographers, they were cooks, farmers, and tradespeople who turned their crafts into covert classrooms. Their greatest innovation, making the code so beautiful, so integrated into daily life, that oppressors never thought to look deeper. What's remarkable is how these systems mirrored the very languages they protected. Just as the forbidden tongue might use suffixes to change a word's meaning, the symbols played with layers. A tile's color could indicate tense, while its shape denoted subject. This wasn't just about hiding, it was about honoring the language's inherent logic, ensuring that even in secrecy, its soul remained intact. Today, museums display these objects as mere artifacts, but if you know how to look, they still speak in whispers across centuries. Behind every forbidden word preserved in stone or thread, there were people, ordinary faces with extraordinary courage. The stonemasons who chiseled coded messages into cathedral walls weren't just craftsmen, they were linguistic smugglers, risking their lives to turn mortar and rock into a secret library. Take the Beguines, a sisterhood of medieval women who lived outside traditional convents. While the church dismissed their textile work as mere domestic labor, these women were spinning more than thread. Their tapestries hid sacred verses in the warp and weft, each stitch a silent act of devotion. To the untrained eye, it was decoration. To those who knew, it was scripture. Then there were the Jewish scribes of Moorish Spain who faced an impossible choice: abandon their sacred texts or find ways to disguise them. Some copied Hebrew prayers into the margins of Latin manuscripts, knowing invaders would overlook the scribbles they deemed insignificant. Others bound Torah scrolls inside covers stamped with crosses, creating holy Trojan horses. These weren't just acts of preservation. They were high-stakes games of cultural hide and seek, where a single mistake meant discovery. What drove them? For some, it was faith, the unshakable belief that their words were a divine covenant. For others, it was pure defiance, a refusal to let conquerors rewrite their story. But perhaps the most powerful motivator was something simpler: love. Parents teaching children rhymes that doubled as resistance anthems, grandparents whispering folktales laced with forbidden grammar. These weren't faceless archivists, they were guardians of identity, ensuring that even if their world burned, the language would live on in the next generation's breath. Their methods were as varied as their motives. In Ottoman-controlled Bulgaria, rug makers encoded Cyrillic letters into floral motifs, turning living room floors into covert textbooks. In Ireland, hedge schools taught Gaelic under the pretense of farming lessons, with students memorizing verb conjugations while pretending to inspect potato crops. The common thread: they all exploited the blind spots of power. Oppressors expected rebellion in shouts and uprisings, not in the curve of a ceramic glaze or the rhythm of a lullaby. Now consider the legacy they left. When a language is banned, its survival hinges on those willing to become living bridges between eras. The scribe who copied a single manuscript by candlelight, knowing it might be the last. The mason who carved one final symbol before the authorities arrived. Their names are often lost to history, but their work echoes in every revived word spoken today. As we follow the language's journey across borders, remember, it didn't travel alone. It was carried in the hands of those who refused to let silence win. When empires ban a language in one place, it often finds sanctuary in another, carried not by armies, but by merchants, migrants, and pilgrims. Picture a spice trader in the 13th century, whispering the forbidden tongue to a fellow traveler at a caravanserai along the Silk Road. Or a family fleeing persecution, stitching fragments of their speech into the folk songs they taught their children around new hearths. This was how the language traveled, not as a conqueror, but as a stowaway, clinging to the edges of maps where power rarely looked. Take Yiddish, born from the fusion of German dialects and Hebrew, then carried across Europe by Jewish communities who refused to let their identity dissolve. It absorbed Slavic words in Poland, French nuances in Alsace, becoming a linguistic mosaic that mirrored the diaspora's resilience. Similarly, Syriac, once the lingua franca of the Near East, retreated into mountain monasteries and migrant enclaves after Arabic dominance, morphing into distinct dialects like Turoyo, spoken today by Assyrian communities in exile. These weren't just languages evolving, they were cultures adapting, bending without breaking. The survival strategy was brilliance in motion. In port cities like Venice or Alexandria, the forbidden tongue might blend with local slang, creating hybrid phrases that sounded innocuous to authorities but carried layered meanings for initiates. A fisherman's greeting in Naples could conceal a verb from the old language, while a weaver's pattern in Istanbul might encode a proverb known only to those from the homeland. This linguistic camouflage allowed the language to hide in the open, worn like a borrowed coat that still kept its original shape beneath. Yet adaptation wasn't just about borrowing, it was about invention. When words for sacred concepts couldn't be spoken aloud, new metaphors emerged. A term for freedom might resurface as the unshackled wind, while home became the place where the walls remember. These poetic evasions did more than preserve meaning. they enriched the language, turning constraints into creativity. What's striking is how these journeys reshaped the tongue without erasing its core. Like a river splitting into streams, each dialect carried traces of the source, an accent, a turn of phrase, a stubborn refusal to let certain words die. Today, scholars tracing these linguistic trails can map migrations more accurately than some historical records, because the language itself became an archive of movement and resistance. The next chapter of its story isn't written in ink or stone, but in the breath of those who carried it across borders, trusting that as long as someone spoke it, home wasn't truly lost. Sacred spaces held more than prayers. They cradled entire languages on the brink of extinction. Step inside a medieval church where the Latin Mass drowned out whispered conversations in forbidden tongues, and you'd find something extraordinary, those same tongues flourishing in the shadows. Take the Celtic Christian monks who recited Loriki, prayers so named because they acted as spiritual armor. To outsiders, these were simple devotions. But woven into their rhythmic lines were archaic words and phrases, preserving a linguistic heritage that kings had tried to erase. The very act of worship became an act of preservation, with each hymn a trove of endangered syntax and vocabulary. Sufi mystics perfected a similar art of linguistic disguise. Their poetry, rich with wine metaphors and lovers' lament, seemed innocuous to authorities. But beneath the surface, the wine symbolized divine knowledge, the beloved stood for spiritual union, and the language itself carried echoes of older, banned dialects. A single couplet could hold multiple meanings, a love poem for the casual listener, a theological treatise for initiates, and a linguistic time capsule for those who knew how to listen. This wasn't just creative expression, it was survival through layered meaning. Synagogues during the Spanish Inquisition became secret classrooms. While rabbis chanted official prayers in Hebrew, children learned clandestine Ladino Judeo-Spanish through coplas, festive songs that smuggled grammar lessons into catchy refrains. The melodies were cheerful enough to avoid suspicion, but their lyrics taught verb conjugations and vocabulary, turning worship into covert language instruction. Even the architecture participated. Some synagogue floors were laid with tiles in geometric patterns that mirrored Hebrew letter shapes, letting worshippers trace the alphabet with their feet during services. Mosques, too, sheltered linguistic rebellion. In Ottoman-controlled regions where local languages were suppressed, Friday sermons often included subtle code switching. A preacher might quote the Quran in Arabic, then seamlessly weave in a proverb or parable in the forbidden tongue, trusting his congregation to recognize the gift. Calligraphy on mosque walls sometimes hid regional dialects within the flourishes of Arabic script, visible only to those who knew where to look. What made religious spaces such effective sanctuaries? Faith and language shared a sacred bond. Both were vessels of identity, both demanded devotion. Persecutors might ban a tongue in the marketplace, but they hesitated to violate the sanctity of worship. And so, while empires rose and fell, these hallowed walls kept whispering what the world tried to silence. The next time you hear an old hymn or gaze at stained glass, consider what else might be shining through. Festivals pulsed with life, and beneath the drums and dancing feet, something far more precious than revelry was being protected. Take the Basque Bertsolaritza, where poets dueled in improvised verses, their rapid-fire rhymes packing centuries of linguistic nuance into playful competitions. To outsiders, it was entertainment, but every syllable was a masterclass in verb forms and vocabulary, passing the language to new generations under the guise of sport. Similarly, Welsh Eisteddfod outturned poetry recitals into covert language labs, where intricate meter rules preserved pronunciation patterns that might otherwise have faded. These weren't just contests, they were linguistic lifelines disguised as celebration. Carnivals offered the perfect cover for subversion. In Venice, masked performers spun tales in the local dialect, officially banned in favor of Italian, using exaggerated gestures to emphasize key phrases for attentive listeners. Harvest festivals across Europe hid forbidden words in the calls of dance leaders, their choreography mimicking the cadence of ancient prayers. Even children's games became tools. Jump rope rhymes in Occitan encoded verb conjugations, while Breton riddles taught sentence structure through wordplay. Laughter disarmed suspicion, turning language preservation into communal joy. The genius lay in making the transmission irresistible. Puppet shows in Sicily adapted forbidden folktales into slapstick comedies, ensuring children absorbed the stories and the dialect through sheer delight. In Sardinia, polyphonic singing groups layered lyrics so densely that authorities heard only harmony, while initiates decoded entire histories in the overlapping verses. Ritual became rebellion. A Catalan fire dance might spell out a banned phrase in the pattern of sparks, or a maypole's ribbons weave syntactic rules into their braids. What made these methods so effective? They transformed oppression's greatest weapon, public scrutiny, into an ally. By embedding the language in spectacle, communities ensured its survival required no secrecy, just collective participation. Every clap, every verse, every burst of applause was an act of defiance wrapped in festivity. And when the music faded, the language lingered not in dusty manuscripts, but in the muscle memory of dancers, the reflexes of poets, the laughter of children who'd unwittingly become its next guardians. But survival through joy had a darker counterpart, the looming shadow of deliberate erasure, where not just words but their very memory was hunted. Attempts to stamp out a language often backfire spectacularly, like trying to extinguish a fire by pouring gasoline on it. Consider the Ottoman Empire's crackdown on Armenian in the 19th century. Authorities banned its use in schools, burned manuscripts, and even imposed fines for speaking it in public. But instead of disappearing, Armenian thrived in the shadows. Families turned their homes into clandestine classrooms, with grandmothers teaching children to read using handmade alphabet books hidden beneath floorboards. Shopkeepers developed coded signage. A certain arrangement of lentils in a market stall might indicate a safe space to speak freely. The harder the empire pressed, the more creatively the language adapted, weaving itself into the fabric of daily life in ways too subtle to legislate against. France's campaign against regional tongues like Occitan reveals another fatal flaw in suppression tactics. For centuries, Paris enforced a brutal policy of linguistic homogenization, punishing schoolchildren for speaking their native dialects with humiliating signs around their necks or strikes to the knuckles. Yet Occitan didn't die, it went underground. Shepherds in the Pyrenees turned grazing calls into covert language lessons, their melodic shouts across valleys preserving vowel sounds outlawed in classrooms. Winegrowers coded vineyard maps with dialect terms, ensuring the next generation learned the words for soil and sun while working the land. The state's obsession with erasure only deepened emotional ties to the forbidden tongue, transforming it from mere communication into a sacred inheritance. Oppression's greatest irony, it often turns language into a banner of resistance. When Scandinavian authorities banned the Sami Joik traditional songs that encode history, genealogy, and even land rights, the response wasn't silence. Singers adapted, disguising joiks as lullabies or weaving them into the rhythms of daily chores. A mother rocking her child might seem to hum a simple tune, but those rising and falling notes carried maps of migratory routes or protests against displacement. Similarly, the Cathars of medieval France, facing extermination for their beliefs, used Indora, a ritual fast, as both spiritual protest and linguistic preservation. Their slow, whispered prayers during hunger strikes kept Occitan alive as a sacred language, ensuring it outlasted the swords of crusaders. What doomed these erasure campaigns wasn't just community ingenuity, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of how language lives. You can burn dictionaries, but you can't burn memory. Outlaw a word in the town square, and it will flourish in bedtime stories. Ban its script, and it will resurface in the embroidery on a wedding dress. Every failed attempt at suppression added another layer to the language's mythos, transforming it from a tool into a testament. Today's revival movements, from Welsh language schools to Cherokee immersion programs, stand on the shoulders of those who refuse to let the whispers die. The lesson written in history's margins is clear. A language persecuted is a language immortalized. The printing press should have been the forbidden language's death knell. Instead, it became its unlikely accomplice. Imagine the irony. A machine designed to mass-produce conformity ended up fueling linguistic rebellion. In hidden basements across Europe, operators risked execution to print flyleaf Bibles, seemingly orthodox texts with razor-thin margins where entire glossaries of banned words were tucked between lines of scripture. A merchant might purchase an approved prayer book, only to discover its spine concealed a pamphlet of verb conjugations or folk tales in the persecuted tongue. These weren't just books, they were Trojan horses smuggled past censors in plain sight. But this technological leap came with complications. While handwritten manuscripts varied naturally, each scribe's quirks preserving regional dialects, the press imposed uniformity. A broadside printed in Antwerp might standardize spelling for readers in Marseille, gradually smoothing out the rough edges of local speech. Some scholars argue this saved the language by creating a unified written form. Others mourn the loss of vibrant dialects crushed under the weight of movable type. The tension echoes today in debates over language revival. Should we preserve historical purity or embrace evolution? Industrialization forced even cleverer adaptations. Factories might produce innocuous-looking almanacs with weather predictions until you noticed the phases of the moon corresponded to letters in the forbidden alphabet, creating acrostics that spelled out proverbs when read vertically. Steam-powered presses in Leipzig churned out botanical illustrations where flower names formed anagrammed vocabulary lists. The language didn't just survive the machine age, it hijacked its tools, turning the very mechanisms meant to erase it into vehicles for its spread. Yet for all its ingenuity, this era also marked a turning point. As printed materials standardized speech, something intangible was lost: the intimate connection between scribe and reader, the regional flavors that once made the language a living mosaic. What emerged was stronger in some ways, weaker in others, a tongue that could now cross borders effortlessly, but carried fewer fingerprints of the hands that had kept it alive. The press didn't kill the language, it transformed it into something its medieval guardians might barely recognize, yet whose heartbeat they'd still understand. Industrialization didn't just reshape landscapes, it rewrote the rules of linguistic survival. As villages emptied into cities, the forbidden language faced its greatest paradox: dispersal and concentration at once. Tight-knit rural communities where knowledge had flowed through generations like water in an underground stream, now fractured under factory whistles and tenement walls. Yet in this chaos, the language found unexpected sanctuaries. Coal mines in Wales became echo chambers for the old tongue, with miners chanting folk songs that doubled as resistance anthems during strikes. To the bosses, it was just rhythmic noise keeping time with pickaxes, but every chorus about the Green Hills or the Old Oak carried covert messages, warnings of crackdowns, signals to slow work, even directions to secret meeting spots. The very industry meant to homogenize labor became a fortress for the language it sought to erase. But urbanization cut both ways. While factories offered cover, schools became battlegrounds. In Native American boarding schools, children as young as 5 had their mouths washed with soap for speaking Lakota or Navajo. Teachers in Ireland tied tally sticks around pupils' necks, notching wood for every Gaelic word uttered, each mark earning a beating. The cruelty had a purpose: to sever the chain of oral tradition, to make the forbidden tongue feel shameful rather than sacred. And yet, even here, resistance flickered. Students in Wales scratched their language onto slate scraps and passed them under desks like contraband. Mohawk children in Canada whispered words for mother and home into each other's palms during forced silences. The classroom designed to erase became an unlikely classroom for coded rebellion. Trade unions emerged as unlikely allies. In the Basque Country, factory workers wove euskara, a language once banned under Franco, into union pamphlets, disguising strike plans as innocent folk tales. Catalan textile workers encoded meeting times into the patterns of their fabric samples, turning industrial looms into linguistic timekeepers. This wasn't nostalgia, it was strategy. Oppressors expected dissent in speeches or manifestos, not in the rhythm of a work song or the stitch of a union banner. The language survived because it became more than communication. It became solidarity, a shibboleth separating ally from informant. Yet the pressures of assimilation were relentless. City life demanded compromise. A Breton farmer might cling to his dialect at home, but his children, desperate to fit into urban schools and shops, began shedding it like an old coat. The language didn't fade from persecution alone, it eroded from 1,000 small surrenders. A parent switching to French to help with homework, a teenager too embarrassed to sing ancestral songs at parties. By the early 20th century, many assumed these tongues were destined for museum displays. Then came the revivalists, not scholars in ivory towers, but ordinary people who refused to let the last embers die. A Welsh housewife named Eileen Beasley shocked authorities by demanding her tax bills in Welsh and went to court for 12 years until they complied. A group of Navajo elders, survivors of those brutal boarding schools, began hosting language nights in trailer parks, trading stories and verbs like precious stones. Their efforts seemed quixotic at first until the tide began to turn. The very infrastructure that once threatened the language, radio, then television, then the internet, became its lifeline. But that's a revolution for another chapter. For now, remember this: when a language survives not in palaces but in factories, not in textbooks but in protest songs, it carries something unbreakable, the will of those who spoke it when silence would have been safer. The 20th century arrived with a paradox. Just as the world seemed to homogenize, the forbidden language found its fiercest champions. Take Elias Lönnrot, a Finnish doctor turned folklorist who trekked through forests and villages collecting ancient runes and chants. To outsiders, it was mere academic curiosity, but when he stitched those fragments into the Kalevala, Finland's national epic, he did more than preserve folklore. He resurrected a linguistic identity that had been buried under Swedish and Russian rule. Suddenly, a language once whispered in huts was being printed in newspapers, performed in theaters, and eventually adopted as Finland's official tongue. This wasn't just revival, it was reinvention, proving that a language could leap from the margins to the mainstream in a single generation. Meanwhile, in Catalonia, poets like Salvador Espriu turned verse into veiled rebellion under Franco's regime. His collection, Cementiri de Cinra, written in Catalan, which was banned in public life, used cemetery imagery to mourn cultural erasure while quietly teaching grammar through rhythm. Every line was a landmine disguised as literature, waiting for readers to uncover its power. Similarly, Basque activists organized clandestine ikastolak schools in church basements and farmhouses, where children learned Euskara through songs and games while police patrolled outside. The lesson was clear: oppression might silence streets, but it couldn't silence stories. Museums became unexpected allies in this linguistic resistance. Ethnomusicologists lugged bulky recording equipment to remote villages, capturing folk songs that elders had carried in memory for decades. These wax cylinders and reel-to-reel tapes weren't just artifacts. They were time machines preserving tones and cadences that textbooks couldn't convey. In Ireland, archivists painstakingly transcribed Sean Noss singing styles, ensuring that the intricate ornamentation of Connemara Irish, a dialect teetering on extinction, wouldn't vanish with its last native speakers. The act of recording became an act of defiance, turning archives into arks for drowning tongues. Yet revival sparked fierce debates. Purists argued the language should remain untouched, a frozen snapshot of its authentic self. Reformers countered that languages are living things, they must adapt or perish. The Breton movement split over whether to modernize vocabulary for televisions and computers or borrow French terms. Welsh activists clashed over standardizing dialects for education, fearing local flavors would dilute. Even the Sami people, whose Joic songs had survived centuries, grappled with whether to transcribe their oral traditions into written form, risking fossilization for the sake of preservation. This tension between purity and practicality echoes today in digital dilemmas. Should an app teaching Occitan use historical spellings or contemporary shortcuts? Can an AI-generated Irish poem truly carry the soul of a language shaped by peat fires and shoreline winds? The answers aren't simple, but the question itself is a victory. After centuries of suppression, the forbidden language isn't just surviving, it's demanding a seat at modernity's table, challenging us to redefine what it means to keep a voice alive. The digital age should have been the forbidden language's final frontier. Instead, it became its wildest reinvention. Scroll through TikTok today, and you'll find Cornish, a Celtic language once declared extinct, thriving in 30-second cooking tutorials and sea shanty remixes. Teenagers in Cornwall aren't just learning verbs, they're turning them into viral challenges where conjugating to be gets more likes than dance trends. Over on Reddit, Cherokee speakers dissect grammar in threads peppered with memes of a stoic sequoia holding a smartphone, as if the script's 19th century inventor had predicted this digital afterlife. What's happening here isn't just revival, it's revolution, where the same platforms that homogenize culture are being hacked into language classrooms. But the algorithm giveth, and the algorithm taketh away. YouTube might auto-caption a Welsh folk song as gibberish, while Facebook's moderation bots flag indigenous Australian words as violations for reasons no human can explain. Tech giants built their systems for dominant languages, leaving marginalized tongues to navigate a digital minefield of glitches and biases. When Instagram's content filters mute posts in Sicilian or Kashubian, it's not malice, it's indifference, the same erasure by omission that once happened when scribes refused to record peasant dialects. The irony stings. The internet could be the greatest archive in history, yet its very architecture risks repeating the old patterns of exclusion. Gaming and virtual reality are rewriting the rules entirely. In Minecraft servers from Norway to New Zealand, players build entire worlds where chat is locked to Sami or Maori, forcing collaboration in the endangered tongue. VR platforms like Altspace host language cafes, where avatars gather around pixelated campfires to practice Manx or Occitan, no passports required. These aren't just games, they're linguistic ecosystems where the pressure to survive is replaced by the joy of play. A teenager in Seoul might master Basque not through textbooks, but by bartering virtual sheep in a multiplayer RPG, proving that immersion doesn't require borders, just bandwidth. The most radical shift: control. For centuries, the forbidden language survived by hiding in cracks of empires. Now, apps like Memrise crowdsource pronunciation guides from elders, while blockchain projects archive dictionaries on decentralized servers no government can wipe. Activists use AI to clone the voices of last speakers, ensuring future generations hear inflection, not just text. The stakes feel lighter. No one's chiseling words into stone or smuggling pamphlets, but the mission remains deadly serious. Every autocorrect that learns Cherokee, every meme that turns Kabyle into a punchline, chips away at the idea that these tongues belong to the past. The digital age won't save the forbidden language by being its museum. It'll succeed by becoming its playground. Gaming worlds have become the new cathedrals for forgotten tongues, where pixels and polygons now do the work of stone and mortar. Take Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where players roaming 9th century England overhear villagers chatting in Old Norse and Old English, dialects meticulously reconstructed by linguists. It's more than historical flavor, it's accidental immersion. A teenager slaying digital dragons might unknowingly absorb the cadence of a language their ancestors spoke centuries ago, blurring the line between play and preservation. Meanwhile, in VR spaces like VR Chat, users gather in floating classrooms to practice Maori or Aramaic, their avatars gesturing as if standing in the same room. The headset becomes a time machine, transporting speakers across continents and eras without a single passport stamp. Constructed languages, or conlangs, are fueling this revival in unexpected ways. When Game of Thrones popularized Dothraki, fans didn't just memorize phrases, they formed online communities to dissect its grammar, sparking interest in how real endangered languages structure thought. Klingon from Star Trek, once a niche hobby, now has fluent speakers hosting podcasts and translating Shakespeare. These fictional tongues act as gateways, proving that learning an unfamiliar language isn't just academic, it's an adventure. The same thrill that drives someone to master Elvish can lead them to explore Welsh or Navajo, turning fantasy into a bridge for real-world linguistic survival. Gamification transforms rote memorization into something epic. Duolingo's Navajo course turns verb conjugations into health points, with learners leveling up by completing daily exercises. Apps like Fluent U splice movie clips in Irish or Yiddish into interactive lessons, rewarding progress with unlockable cultural insights. Even Minecraft gets in on the action. Modders have built entire worlds where signs and NPCs communicate only in Cherokee or Breton, forcing players to decode words to gather resources or solve puzzles. Failure means getting lost. Success means unlocking the next fragment of a living heritage. The brilliance of this digital renaissance lies in its accessibility. Where medieval stonemasons risked their lives to carve messages, today's learners tap screens. A farmer in Bolivia can practice Aymara with a student in Tokyo via a language exchange app. A grandmother in Nova Scotia records Micmac folktales for a podcast heard by grandchildren who have never set foot on tribal lands. Geography once dictated a language's fate, now Wi-Fi does. Yet challenges linger. Autocorrect fights against incorrect spellings in minority tongues, and voice recognition software often stumbles over non-standard accents. The digital world isn't a utopia, it's another frontier where the language must adapt or fade. What emerges is a vision both ancient and cutting edge. A future where the forbidden tongue thrives not in hidden courtyards, but in open source code and global servers. The same ingenuity that once hid words in tilework now encrypts them in algorithms. And as virtual reality evolves, these digital sanctuaries may become the most resilient architecture, yet places where the language doesn't just survive, but sings. Science is rewriting the story of language survival not in dusty manuscripts, but in strands of DNA. In the Basque Country, where Euskara has defied extinction for centuries, geneticists discovered something astonishing. The same unique haplogroups that mark Basque ancestry also correlate with fluency in their ancient tongue. It's as if the language left its fingerprint in the bloodlines of those who carried it. Projects like Living Tongues take this further, collecting saliva samples alongside oral histories, creating a dual archive where genetic code and verb conjugations intertwine. A grandmother's story about herding sheep in the Pyrenees isn't just recorded, it's linked to her mitochondrial DNA, binding culture to biology in a way that would make medieval cryptographers gasp. But this breakthrough isn't just about tracing the past, it's igniting the future. Imagine a teenager in Buenos Aires taking a DNA test and discovering not just Basque roots, but a prompt to learn Euskara through an app tailored to their genetic heritage. Companies like MyHeritage already partner with language platforms, suggesting courses based on ancestry reports. For diaspora communities severed from their tongues by oceans or generations, genetics could be the unexpected bridge back. A Cherokee descendant in Oklahoma might rediscover their language not through family lore, long silenced by forced assimilation, but through a haplogroup match that unlocks access to tribal language resources. Yet the ethical complexities run deep. Who owns the rights to a language encoded in DNA? When a biotech firm analyzes saliva samples from remote Andean villages to study Quechua speakers' genetic markers, does that data belong to the individuals, the community, or science at large? Some indigenous groups, wary of exploitation, insist on DNA sovereignty, controlling how their biological and linguistic heritage is used. Others see an opportunity. In New Zealand, Maori geneticists work with elders to sequence DNA from ancestral remains, pairing it with reconstructed dialects to create immersive language experiences for youth. The goal isn't just revival, it's reclamation, proving that a language isn't just spoken, it's inherited. The most provocative question isn't whether genes influence language, but whether language can influence genes. Studies of Finnish communities show that tonal patterns in their speech may have shaped auditory genetics over generations, literally tuning ears to the cadence of their mother tongue. If true, it means the forbidden language didn't just survive in whispers, it altered the bodies of those who guarded it, creating a biological imperative to keep listening. As we stand on the brink of CRISPR and AI, this research hints at a future where linguistic revival isn't just cultural, it's coded into our very cells. The stones may have stopped whispering, but the double helix is just beginning to speak. Language ownership isn't just a modern legal quirk, it's a battlefield where history, identity, and power collide. Picture this: Disney's animated blockbuster, Mona, sparked global joy, but for the Maori people, the film's portrayal of the demigod Maui cut deep. Their ancestral stories, passed down through generations in sacred chants, were suddenly copyrighted by a studio halfway across the world. The outrage wasn't about money, it was about agency. When a corporation trademarks words like aloha or wakapapa, it's not just commerce, it's colonization repackaged for the digital age. These clashes force us to ask, can a language, woven into the very bones of a culture, ever truly belong to anyone but its people? The Hopi nation faced a similar reckoning when recordings of their ceremonies, made by anthropologists in the early 20th century, ended up in university archives locked behind paywalls or played in museums without consent. To outsiders, these were academic resources. To the Hopi, they were living prayers, never meant to be severed from ritual or commodified as curiosities. Their fight to reclaim these recordings mirrors medieval monks smuggling illuminated manuscripts from invaders, proving that the theft of language isn't a relic, it's a recurring wound. Legal systems stagger under these questions. In New Zealand, the Waitangi Tribunal ruled that Te Reo Maori, the indigenous language, is a taonga, a treasure protected by treaty. Yet in the United States, courts routinely side with corporations, arguing that languages can't be owned under copyright law. The dissonance is stark. One nation recognizes language as the lifeblood of identity, while another reduces it to lines of code in a trademark database. Even UNESCO declarations on intangible cultural heritage crumble when pitted against the brute force of intellectual property law. But ownership is only half the struggle. Consider the case of the Cherokee syllabary, meticulously crafted by Sequoyah in the 19th century. Today, tech companies use the script in font packages and apps, often without consulting the Cherokee Nation. It's a paradox. The very tools that could help revitalize the language also risk divorcing it from its guardians. When a keyboard app profits from a writing system that once cost people their lives to protect, who bears the moral debt? The echoes are uncanny, like medieval scribes who copied banned texts, only to have their work claimed by kings. Amid these battles, living speakers are rewriting the rules on their own terms. In Norway, the Sami broadcast their own news in their own tongue, bypassing state media monopolies. In Hawaii, immersion schools teach keiki children through Olelo Hawaii, not just as a subject, but as the language of math, science, and play. These aren't just acts of preservation, they're declarations of sovereignty. Every time a Maori grandmother files a lawsuit over misused proverbs, or a Hopi elder reclaims a stolen recording, they're doing what their ancestors did, refusing to let their words become artifacts. The heart of these conflicts beats in a single, unanswerable question. Is language property or personhood? Corporations see dictionaries, communities see ancestors. Legal systems see contracts, cultures see covenants. As long as profit and power shape the rules, the battles will rage. But so will the voices of those who know the truth. A language isn't just spoken. It's lived, and no court can copyright a heartbeat. In a dimly lit classroom in Brittany, a woman named Hélène holds up a faded postcard of her grandfather's farm. This, she tells her students, tapping the weathered image, is why we're here. The card is written in Gallo, a Romance language teetering on extinction, its words as fragile as the paper they're printed on. Hélène isn't just teaching verb conjugations, she's stitching together fragments of a world her students' great-grandparents knew intimately. Outside, shop signs blare in French, and playground chatter drowns out the old dialect. But here, between photocopied worksheets and sticky notes of vocabulary, Gallo breathes again. Some students come out of curiosity. Others, like the teenage boy in the back row, arrive clutching notebooks filled with family letters they can't yet read. They told us it was useless. Hélène laughs, her voice sharp with defiance. But useless things don't survive centuries in secret. 600 miles southeast, in a Sicilian village where Greco, a Hellenic dialect, clings to life, 94-year-old Nonna Lucia rocks her great-granddaughter to sleep with the same lullaby her own mother once sang. The melody curls through the room like smoke, the words a whispered thread connecting generations. Greco has no official alphabet, no standardized grammar. Yet in Lucia's raspy cadence, it's alive. When I'm gone, she tells her family, the song stays. Her insistence isn't nostalgia, it's resistance. During World War II, her brother was beaten by soldiers for speaking Greco in the streets. Now the language survives in kitchen recipes, superstitions muttered over olive trees, and the stubborn refrains of lullabies. What drives people like Hélène and Lucia to fight for languages the world has labeled obsolete? For some, it's grief, the unbearable quiet of losing the words your grandmother called you by. For others, it's rage against the lie that only useful languages deserve to exist. And then there are those who simply refuse to let their history become someone else's footnote. Their tools are humble: a smartphone recording an elder's stories, a YouTube channel teaching forbidden rhymes, a graffiti artist spraying Provençal poetry on city walls. The battle isn't fought in parliaments or universities. It's won in living rooms and subway cars, anywhere a whispered word can defy silence. This revival isn't confined to dusty archives. Listen closely and you'll hear echoes of these resilient tongues in unexpected places. A Welsh rap song topping the charts, its verses peppered with Cymric slang. A Navajo stand-up comedian weaving punchlines from boarding school trauma, and the language that outlasted it. Even Hollywood's catching on. The hit series Dark featured dialogue in Low German, a tongue once banned in schools, now streaming to millions. These pop culture moments aren't just nods to diversity. They're proof that languages once hunted are now coveted, their very rarity making them irresistible. So here's a challenge. Next time you greet someone, try swapping hello for a word from your own dialect or heritage. Maybe it's howdy from your Texas roots, aloha from your Hawaiian uncle, or shalom from your grandmother's stories. You might be surprised how many variations exist and how fiercely they cling to life in the corners of our mouths. Because every time we choose an uncommon word over the default, we're doing what those medieval stonemasons did, building something that lasts one small, defiant stone at a time. The moment a fictional language from Game of Thrones starts trending on Duolingo, something fascinating is happening. Valerian, crafted by linguist David Peterson, wasn't just a plot device. It became a cultural phenomenon, with fans dissecting its grammar like scholars studying Latin. Meanwhile, Disney's Encanto didn't just introduce global audiences to Colombian magic. It slipped Palenquero, a Spanish-based Creole with African roots, into Lin-Manuel Miranda's lyrics. Suddenly, a language once spoken only in a few villages was streaming in millions of homes. This isn't just exposure, it's alchemy, turning niche tongues into global curiosities overnight. But the spotlight comes with shadows. When Björk sings in Icelandic, she's reclaiming a heritage nearly erased by Danish rule. When Youssou N'Dour performs in Wolof, he's weaving Senegal's oral traditions into modern beats. These artists aren't just using language, they're honoring its soul. Contrast that with a car commercial peppered with Maori phrases to sound exotic, or a fashion brand slapping Cherokee syllabary on t-shirts without context. The difference: one elevates the exploits. The line between celebration and appropriation often hinges on who controls the narrative and who profits from it. Tourism complicates things further. In Wales, road signs in Cymric draw visitors eager for authenticity, boosting local pride and economies. But in Hawaii, Alilo Hawaii phrases slapped on hotel menus can feel like performance, reducing a sacred tongue to a marketing gimmick. The irony: the same tourists who marvel at hearing Sami in a reindeer-dotted Lapland ad might never learn that Norway once punished children for speaking it. Visibility alone isn't victory, it's what happens after the cameras leave that matters. The real test is who benefits. When Netflix's Ragnarok features dialogue in Sami, it funds local filmmakers and hires indigenous consultants. When a video game like Horizon Forbidden West includes dialogue in Tenact, a constructed language inspired by Pueblo languages, it collaborates with native advisors to avoid caricature. These projects prove media can be both bridge and benefactor, turning curiosity into tangible support. But for every respectful portrayal, there's a lazy trope, like fantasy films using gibberish that just mimics stereotyped native sounds, further flattening real languages. What's emerging is a new frontier of linguistic agency. Artists like Nunavut's Tanya Tagaq Throat sing in Inuktitut not as a novelty, but as a radical assertion of presence. Bands like Mongolia's The Who set heavy metal riffs to traditional Mongolian throat singing, their lyrics deliberately untranslated in liner notes, their message. This language doesn't exist for your comprehension, it exists because it must. That shift from spectacle to sovereignty might be the most promising evolution of all. The next time you hear an unfamiliar tongue in a song or show, ask not just what it's saying, but who it's serving and who gets to decide. Tourism wields a strange power over endangered languages. It can breathe life into them or turn them into caricatures. Walk through Honolulu's bustling markets, and you'll find Alilo Hawaii printed on everything from surfboards to coffee mugs. At first glance, this seems like victory. A language once banned in schools now splashed across merchandise, its words traveling the world in suitcases. But look closer and the tension becomes clear. When aloha is reduced to a decorative font on a cheap keychain, stripped of its layers of meaning, love, compassion, breath, does it still carry the soul of the language? The same shops selling those trinkets might host authentic luau's where elders teach traditional chants, with profits funding Hawaiian immersion schools. Here, tourism isn't just commodification, it's a lifeline turning visitors into unwitting patrons of revival. Contrast this with the Pacific Northwest, where souvenir stands peddle plastic totem poles stamped with generic indigenous design. The Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples, whose cultures birthed these sacred carvings, rarely see a cent from these sales. Worse, the symbols are often misused or mashed together without context, turning profound ancestral narratives into kitsch. The harm isn't just economic, it's spiritual. When a language's sacred terms are slapped onto shot glasses or bumper stickers, their power erodes. A Cherokee elder once lamented seeing the word selu, corn, a sacred sustainer printed on a bag of tortilla, chips with no explanation. It's not just about the word, she said. It's about the stories that word carries. Yet responsible tourism offers a counterbalance. In New Zealand, Maori-run cultural experiences like Maori stays or waka canoe workshops require visitors to learn basic te reo phrases before participating. The proceeds fund language nests where preschoolers are taught entirely in Maori. Similarly, in the Scottish Highlands, Gaelic-speaking guides lead hiking tours where place names become lessons in ecology and history. Travelers leave not just with photos, but with the cadence of the language in their ears and donations supporting local archives. This model flips the script. Instead of extracting culture, it reinvests in it, treating language not as a souvenir, but as a living exchange. The line between harm and help often comes down to who holds the reins. When the Sami in Norway launched a language safari, inviting tourists to track reindeer while learning indigenous vocabulary, they controlled every detail, from the script to the prophets. Compare that to a generic Native American heritage tour run by outsiders, where ceremonial terms are mispronounced by guides and prophets vanish into corporate coffers. The difference is agency. One approach treats the language as a collaborator, the other as a prop. Perhaps the most hopeful trend is the rise of linguistic voluntarism. Programs like Guatemala's K'ich language homestays or Brittany's Breton farm stays let travelers work alongside locals, picking up phrases while helping document oral histories. These initiatives don't just fund preservation, they create allies. A German accountant might return home to lobby for minority language rights after hearing a Breton farmer describe how his grandfather was punished for speaking it. That's the alchemy of thoughtful tourism. It can turn spectators into stakeholders, ensuring the language isn't just seen but sustained. The real test isn't whether a language can survive commercialization, but whether it can steer it. Languages don't just disappear, they transform. Right now, as you read this, somewhere in the world, a last fluent speaker of a dwindling dialect is teaching their grandchild a nursery rhyme, while across the globe, teenagers are mashing together words from different tongues to create entirely new ways of communicating. The statistics are stark. By the year 2100, half of today's 7,000 languages may fade into silence. But here's the twist: extinction isn't the only path. Just as Latin fractured into French, Spanish, and Italian centuries ago, today's endangered languages are morphing into unexpected hybrids. Spanglish blends English and Spanish with playful fluidity, while Singlish weaves Chinese, Malay, and English into a linguistic tapestry unique to Singapore's streets. The question isn't just whether the forbidden language will survive, it's what survival even looks like. Purists and innovators are locked in a debate as old as language itself. In Wales, archivists painstakingly record elderly speakers' voices, preserving Cymraeg exactly as it's been spoken for generations. Meanwhile, in Miami, reggaeton artists casually flip between English and Spanish mid-chorus, crafting rhythms that grammar textbooks couldn't predict. Both approaches have merit. Preservation guards against erasure, ensuring future generations hear the language as their ancestors intended. But adaptation lets it breathe, bending to fit new realities without breaking. The medieval monks who hid their sacred texts in plain sight faced the same dilemma. Should they copy every word unchanged or revise passages to resonate with new audiences? Their answer: both. Some manuscripts stayed pristine, others evolved, and somehow the language endured. Technology is accelerating this evolution in ways no medieval scribe could have imagined. Text messages in Nahuatl, an indigenous Mexican language, now mix traditional vocabulary with emojis, a pictographic shorthand that eerily mirrors the Aztec glyphs their ancestors once carved into stone. In Greenland, Kalaalleq speakers use TikTok to teach slang their grandparents never knew, proving that a language can stay alive not by resisting change, but by riding its waves. Even the forbidden tongue we've followed through history isn't immune. Linguists tracking its modern descendants find startling mutations, loanwords from dominant languages creeping in, verb structures simplifying, old idioms repurposed for new contexts. To some, this is decay. To others, it's reinvention, the linguistic equivalent of a forest regenerating after a fire. What's truly at stake isn't just vocabulary or grammar, but the worldview embedded in the language itself. The Maori concept of Whakapapa, which weaves genealogy and land into a single linguistic tapestry, can't be neatly translated into English without losing its essence. When a language fades, so does its unique way of framing time, relationships, even existence. Yet hybrid languages create new possibilities. Singlishes, la and ah particles, borrowed from Chinese dialects, convey nuances of tone and social hierarchy that rigid English syntax can't capture. The forbidden language's future may lie not in choosing between purity and change, but in finding the sweet spot where its soul persists even as its form shifts. The irony: the very forces that once threatened the language, globalization, technology, cultural blending, might now save it. Online communities rally around obscure dialects, turning them into badges of identity rather than shame. AI tools help reconstruct lost pronunciations from century-old wax recordings, and in a twist medieval builders never saw coming, Virtual reality could become the new architecture, digital spaces where the language thrives untethered from borders or politics. The stones may have stopped whispering, but the servers are just warming up. So is this extinction or evolution? Perhaps it's both. Languages, like living things, must adapt or perish. But adaptation doesn't have to mean surrender. The forbidden language survived empires by hiding in plain sight. Now it faces a new test, not just to endure, but to mean something to generations who have never known persecution. Its greatest trick wasn't outlasting the past, but remaining relevant enough to be carried into the future. And if history's taught us anything, it's that this language has always been at its most powerful when everyone assumed it was already gone. The story of the forbidden language isn't just about words, it's about the unbreakable human spirit. Think of those medieval stonemasons carving symbols into cathedral walls, knowing they might never live to hear those words spoken aloud. Or the mothers humming lullabies laced with forbidden grammar, their voices a bridge between generations. These weren't just acts of preservation, they were acts of love, defiance, and sheer stubbornness. Every hidden message in a tapestry, every coded proverb in a folk tale, was a quiet rebellion against the idea that a culture could be erased with the stroke of a pen. What makes this story so powerful is how ordinary its heroes were. They weren't kings or scholars, they were weavers, farmers, and children. A Basque shepherd teaching his dog commands in Euskara so the language would live on in barks and whistles. A Sicilian grandmother slipping Greco phrases into recipes, knowing hunger would ensure her grandchildren memorized them. These small, daily acts of resistance added up to something extraordinary, a language that outlasted empires. And here's the thing, this isn't just history, it's happening right now. In living rooms from Wales to Hawaii, parents are choosing to raise their children in tongues the world calls useless. Teenagers are texting in Cherokee syllabary, turning smartphones into modern-day Rosetta Stones. Even the digital age, which many feared would homogenize language, has become its unexpected ally. Online forums reconstruct lost dialects from fragments, while AI deciphers wax-cylinder recordings of the last fluent speakers. The tools have changed, but the mission remains the same, to ensure no voice is silenced forever. So the next time you pass an old building, pause, run your fingers along its bricks, and consider what might be woven into their cracks, that floral motif above the doorway. It could be a poem, the pattern in the floor tiles, maybe a map to somewhere sacred. The forbidden language teaches us that survival isn't always loud sometimes. It's hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. Your turn now. What's the word or tradition your family refused to let fade? A recipe, a saying, a way of pronouncing your name that carries generations in its syllables. Share it below, because every time we pass these fragments forward, we're adding another stone to the wall. And who knows, centuries from now, someone might trace their fingers over what we've left behind and hear the echo. Subscribe to keep uncovering the stories hidden in plain sight. Remember, the world's most resilient languages weren't preserved in grand speeches, but in the spaces between breaths, and that's where they'll keep living.